A billionaire takes an orphan girl home, hoping to give her a better life. But when she starts sketching images of a mansion she's never seen, he realizes there's something extraordinary about her. As he digs deeper, he uncovers a shocking truth that flips his world upside down. She's not just an orphan, she's his daughter. How did she end up alone, and can this fractured family overcome the mistakes of the past to find a future together? This heartwarming story of love, redemption, and second chances will leave you breathless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn wind whipped around Harrison Cole as he stepped out of his black Mercedes, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. Dead leaves skittered past his feet, dancing in small whirlwinds before settling against the fence. The orphanage's brick walls, weathered by time and neglect, stood before him like a silent guardian. A crooked sign reading, "Oakwood Children's Home," creaked in the breeze, its paint peeling at the edges. Harrison straightened his navy wool coat and checked his watch, a habit born from years of business meetings. But this wasn't a business meeting. This was about making sure his monthly donations were being put to good use. He'd been writing checks for years, but something had prompted him to see the results for himself. "Mr. Cole," Mrs. Warren hurried down the worn concrete steps, her gray cardigan fluttering. "We weren't expecting you today." Her smile was tight, worry lines creasing her forehead. She tucked a strand of graying hair behind her ear, clearly flustered by his sudden appearance. "I prefer unannounced visits, Mrs. Warren." Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. "Shall we?" Inside, the hallway's fluorescent lights flickered, casting uneven shadows on the scuffed linoleum floor. Mrs. Warren wrung her hands as they walked, her wedding ring catching the unsteady light. "We're doing our best with what we have," she explained, gesturing to a water stain on the ceiling. "But with only 3 full-time staff members and 28 children." Her voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken needs. Harrison's chest tightened. He should have visited sooner. The signs of wear were everywhere, from the chipped baseboards to the patched walls. They passed a kitchen where mismatched plates sat in drying racks, then a playroom with well-worn books and toys. Each room told the same story of making do with too little. A stuffed bear with a sewn-up arm sat in a reading corner, while puzzle boxes held together with tape lined the shelves. "And here's our art room," Mrs. Warren said, pushing open a door that squeaked on its hinges. The room was small but bright, with large windows letting in the gray afternoon light. Children sat at round tables, heads bent over paper, the scratch of crayons and colored pencils filling the air. The walls were covered with artwork, stick figure families, rainbow houses, and crayon sunsets. But Harrison's attention was immediately drawn to a small girl in the corner. She sat alone, her curly brown hair escaping from a messy bun, wearing a faded blue sweater that was slightly too big for her. Her face was serious as she worked, completely lost in her drawing. Harrison moved closer, curious about what held her attention so completely. His breath caught. On her paper, drawn with remarkable detail, was his mansion. Every window, every architectural detail was perfect, from the distinctive columns to the wraparound porch he'd had restored last summer. Even the ivy that climbed the eastern wall was rendered with stunning accuracy. "That's..." Harrison cleared his throat. "That's quite impressive." The girl looked up, startled. Her green eyes were wary as she hugged the sketchpad closer, her fingers leaving smudges of graphite on its edges. "I'm Harrison," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "May I ask your name?" "Ellie," she whispered. "Ellie Harper." "Your drawing is very accurate, Ellie. Have you visited my house before?" She shook her head, looking down at her hands, which were stained with pencil marks. Mrs. Warren stepped forward. "Ellie has a remarkable gift for art. She's been with us for 3 years now, ever since her mother passed away." Her voice softened with sympathy. Harrison felt something shift inside him as he looked at this quiet child with such extraordinary talent. There was something about her, something that made him want to know more, something hauntingly familiar in those green eyes. Back in his car, rain started to patter against the windshield, creating a gentle rhythm. Harrison held Ellie's drawing, which she'd shyly offered him before he left. His fingers traced the precise lines, wondering how she'd captured his home so perfectly without ever seeing it. But more than that, he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Ellie Harper was somehow important, though he couldn't explain why. The drawing trembled slightly in his hands as memories he'd long buried began to surface. Harrison sat in his leather armchair, the study's mahogany walls seeming to close in around him. Outside, darkness had settled over the grounds, and the only light came from his desk lamp and the amber glow of whiskey in his crystal glass. The ice clinked as he swirled it, lost in thought. The familiar weight of solitude pressed against his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Ellie's drawing lay on his desk. The precision of every detail was remarkable, from the ivy climbing the mansion's west wing to the intricate ironwork of the garden gates. But it wasn't just the technical skill that haunted him. It was something in the way she'd captured the soul of the place, its loneliness. Even the shadows she'd sketched seemed to tell a story of waiting, of rooms yearning to be filled with life again. Margaret would have loved her, he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely disturbing the stillness. Rising from his chair, Harrison walked to the built-in bookshelf and pulled out a worn photo album, its corners softened by years of handling. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. There she was, Margaret, her eyes bright with hope, holding a pale yellow baby blanket. They'd bought it the day they decided to adopt, before the cancer diagnosis changed everything. The fabric had been so soft, chosen with such care and excitement for a future that never came to be. "We had such plans," he murmured, touching the photograph gently, tracing the outline of her smile. Sleep eluded him that night, his thoughts chasing themselves in endless circles. By morning, his mind was made up. The drive back to Oakwood felt different this time, purposeful, each mile bringing him closer to a decision that could change everything. Mrs. Warren's eyes widened when he stepped into her office, her hand pausing over the paperwork she'd been reviewing. "Mr. Cole? 2 visits in 2 days?" "I want to foster Ellie," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of countless sleepless hours. Mrs. Warren's mouth opened, then closed. She adjusted her glasses nervously, pushing them up her nose. "Mr. Cole, while we're grateful for your interest, Ellie is, well, she's had a difficult time. She's very reserved, especially with adults. It takes her a long time to trust people." "I understand," Harrison replied, his voice soft but determined. "But every child deserves a chance at a better life. I can provide that for her." His words held an undertone of something deeper, a promise not just to Ellie but to himself. Back at the mansion, Harrison gathered his staff in the kitchen. Mrs. Clara, who had been his housekeeper for 15 years, listened intently as he explained his decision, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "A child?" Mrs. Clara's round face lit up, though concern flickered in her eyes. This house could certainly use some young energy. "But are you sure you're ready, Mr. Cole?" James, the butler, stood stiffly by the door, his posture rigid with uncertainty. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss the practical implications." "The decision is made," Harrison said firmly, brooking no argument. "We'll need to prepare a room for her." His tone softened as he added, "The blue bedroom in the east wing, I think. It has the best morning light." Later that evening, Harrison stood at his study window watching the garden below. The flower beds Margaret had once tended lay dormant, waiting for spring. The swing set they'd installed years ago had never held a child, its empty seats swaying gently in the evening breeze. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest. Hope, mixed with nervous anticipation. The foster care paperwork sat on his desk, filled out and ready to be submitted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, the empty mansion didn't feel quite so lonely. Instead, it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the sound of small footsteps to echo through its halls once more. The black iron gate swung open with a gentle creak as Mrs. Warren's car made its way up the winding driveway, tires crunching softly on the gravel. In the back seat, Ellie gripped her worn suitcase tighter, her green eyes growing wider as the mansion came into full view. The building seemed even more massive than in her drawings, its weathered stone walls stretching toward the cloudy morning sky like something from a fairy tale. "It's quite something, isn't it?" Mrs. Warren said softly, catching Ellie's awestruck expression in the rearview mirror. She reached back to pat Ellie's shoulder reassuringly. "Everything will be fine, dear. You'll see." Harrison and Mrs. Clara stood waiting at the grand entrance framed by towering wooden doors. Mrs. Clara's warm smile brightened her round face, creating little wrinkles around her eyes, while Harrison stood tall and straight, his hands clasped behind his back, his expensive suit perfectly pressed. "Welcome home, Ellie," Mrs. Clara said, stepping forward as Mrs. Warren helped Ellie out of the car. Her voice carried genuine warmth that seemed to soften the mansion's imposing presence. "We're so happy to have you here." Ellie nodded politely, her fingers white-knuckled around her suitcase handle. Her eyes darted between the adults, taking in Harrison's expensive tailored suit and perfectly combed hair, and Mrs. Clara's kind face and flour-dusted apron. "Let me show you around," Mrs. Clara offered, gently placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder. The touch was gentle, maternal. "This place might seem big at first, but you'll get used to it in no time. It's really quite cozy once you know your way around." As they walked through the mansion, Ellie remained quiet, though her artist's eye caught every detail. The intricate crown molding she'd drawn so many times from photographs, the massive crystal chandelier that sent rainbow spots dancing across the polished marble floor, the familiar curve of the main staircase with its gleaming mahogany banister. Harrison trailed behind them, clearing his throat occasionally as if to speak, but never quite finding the words. His footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors. At lunch in the formal dining room, he tried again, his fingers fidgeting with his napkin. "Do you like chicken soup, Ellie?" he asked, his voice careful and measured, like someone trying not to startle a baby deer. "Yes, sir," Ellie replied softly, her spoon barely making a sound against the delicate china bowl. "Mrs. Clara makes the best soup in the state," Harrison added quickly, looking to Mrs. Clara for help, his expression almost pleading. "Oh, that's kind of you to say," Mrs. Clara chimed in smoothly, her voice warm and encouraging. "You know, Ellie, Mr. Cole told me you're quite the artist. We have some lovely views from the upstairs windows that I think you might enjoy drawing. The gardens are especially beautiful this time of year." After lunch, Mrs. Clara led Ellie to her new room on the second floor. The walls were painted a soft cream color, with flowing silk curtains framing a large window seat cushioned in pale blue velvet. A sturdy wooden desk stood in one corner, its surface clean and waiting, promising endless possibilities. Ellie carefully unpacked her few belongings, her treasured sketchbooks with their worn corners, her collection of pencils arranged by hardness, and a small, slightly creased photo of her mother. She arranged the art supplies on the desk with precise movements, each item finding its designated spot as if she were setting up a miniature world of her own. As evening approached, Ellie perched on the window seat, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. The garden below stretched out like a living canvas, with its perfectly manicured hedges and winding stone pathways bathed in golden sunset light. Her pencil moved across the paper with familiar comfort as she captured the scene, adding subtle shadows and highlights, while questions about her new life swirled silently in her mind like autumn leaves in the wind. The Tuesday morning sun streamed through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Harrison stood outside Ellie's door, adjusting his tie for the third time before raising his hand to knock. His knuckles barely touched the wood, his hesitation evident in the gentle motion. "Ellie? Breakfast is ready if you'd like to join me." He tried to keep his voice warm and inviting, though uncertainty crept in at the edges. A few moments passed before the door opened with a soft click. Ellie emerged in a simple blue dress that reminded Harrison of summer skies, her curly hair neatly combed and falling past her shoulders. In the dining room, Harrison watched as Ellie carefully spread strawberry jam on her toast, making sure to cover every corner. "Do you have any favorite subjects in school?" he asked, his voice slightly strained, fingers drumming nervously on the tablecloth. "My art class," Ellie replied quietly, not looking up from her plate. She took small, careful bites of her toast. And besides art? Science is okay. Her answers remained brief, her shoulders slightly hunched as she seemed to curl into herself. After breakfast, Harrison cleared his throat. Would you like to see the grounds? The gardens are quite extensive. He gestured toward the French doors leading outside, hoping to spark some interest. Ellie nodded, following him outside. The morning air was crisp and dew still clung to the grass like tiny diamonds. As they walked along the stone path, Harrison pointed out different features: the rose garden with its rainbow of blooms, the three-tiered marble fountain, the ancient oak tree that had stood sentinel for generations. Ellie's eyes grew wider with each new sight, her artist's mind clearly at work, drinking in every detail. She paused near a cluster of purple and yellow wildflowers, her head tilted slightly as if mentally composing a drawing. Harrison noticed her fingers twitching the way they often did when she wanted to sketch, a habit he'd already begun to recognize and understand. That evening, Harrison walked into the living room and stopped short. Ellie sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, her sketchbook propped against her knees, completely absorbed in her work. The fireplace cast a warm glow over her work as her pencil moved across the paper with surprising confidence. Harrison approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, not wanting to startle her. Looking over her shoulder, he saw she'd captured the garden, but with a magical twist. The flowers seemed to dance across the page, their petals caught in an invisible breeze, and the fountain sparkled with impossible light that seemed to leap off the paper. That's really beautiful, Ellie, he said softly, genuine admiration in his voice. Ellie glanced up at him and, for the first time since arriving, gave him a small, genuine smile that made her whole face light up. Later, as she headed upstairs for bed, Ellie clutched her sketchbook close to her chest like a treasured friend. The day's drawings were safely tucked inside, along with a tiny spark of hope about her new home. Her footsteps on the stairs seemed lighter than they had been that morning. The Wednesday afternoon rain drummed steadily against the study's windows, creating a melancholic rhythm that echoed through the quiet room. Harrison sat at his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork from the orphanage. His usually neat workspace was cluttered with manila folders and official documents, their corners dog-eared from constant handling. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. Mrs. Clara entered with a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea, her motherly eyes taking in his intense focus and the slight furrow between his brows. She placed the cup near his right hand, careful not to disturb the papers that seemed to have multiplied since morning. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara," Harrison murmured, barely looking up from the document that held his attention. She lingered for a moment, concern etched on her face and her hands clasped together, before quietly leaving the room with practiced discretion. Harrison continued scanning the documents, his eyes moving methodically across each page as if searching for hidden clues. Suddenly, his hand froze mid-turn. There, printed in clear black letters, was the name that made his heart skip. Ellie Harper. Harper. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. "Caroline," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the persistent rain. Memories flooded back, memories he'd carefully locked away for years, like precious artifacts too painful to examine. Caroline Harper, with her radiant smile and infectious laugh that could light up any room. The way her eyes crinkled when she was happy, forming tiny starbursts at the corners. Their stolen moments between college classes, sharing dreams and coffee on worn wooden benches, planning a future together that never came to be. His hands shaking slightly, Harrison pushed back from his desk and walked to the old bookcase that lined the far wall. Behind a row of leather-bound classics, he kept a worn shoebox, its corners soft from age. Inside were letters, photos, and mementos from a life that seemed like someone else's now, preserved like pressed flowers between pages of time. He found what he was looking for, a slightly faded photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. Caroline stood in a sunlit park, her natural hair catching the light like a halo, her smile as bright as he remembered. They had been so young, so full of dreams and possibilities until his father's prejudices tore them apart like paper in a storm. "You're throwing away your future," his father had said, his voice cold and cutting like steel. "That girl isn't right for our family. Think about your position, your responsibilities." Harrison had given in to the pressure, choosing his inheritance over love like a coward. Caroline disappeared shortly after, leaving no forwarding address, no way to contact her, vanishing like morning mist. He'd never forgiven himself for that betrayal. Now, sitting heavily in his leather armchair, Harrison stared at Caroline's photograph as if it might speak to him. Could it be possible? The timing would be right. Ellie's age, her artistic talent that seemed so hauntingly familiar, even her delicate features that stirred something in his memory. The rain continued its steady pattern against the windows as Harrison sat motionless, his mind racing with possibilities and questions that demanded answers. He looked from the photograph to Ellie's paperwork and back again, connecting invisible dots. Something inside him knew he needed to uncover the truth, regardless of how painful it might be or what it would cost him. Thursday morning arrived with a pale sun struggling to break through lingering clouds, casting muted shadows across the mansion grounds. Harrison sat at his mahogany desk, his cell phone feeling heavy in his hand as doubts and questions swirled through his mind. He took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keypad before finally dialing a number he hadn't used in months. "Mark? It's Harrison Cole. I need your help with something sensitive." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Dr. Mark Harris, his friend of 20 years and trusted confidant, listened quietly as Harrison explained his suspicions about Ellie. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, even though he was alone in his study, as if the very walls might betray his secret. "I need a DNA test, Mark, but it has to be discreet. Can you come to the mansion today?" Harrison's knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. Throughout the morning, Harrison's stomach churned with anxiety, making him feel like a teenager again. During breakfast, he barely touched his eggs and toast, pushing them around his plate listlessly, earning concerned glances from Mrs. Clara. He avoided the garden where Ellie usually sketched, making excuses about urgent work calls whenever anyone asked about his whereabouts. At lunch, the dining room felt thick with tension, the air almost too heavy to breathe. Ellie pushed her food around her plate, stealing quick glances at Harrison between bites, her small shoulders hunched forward, making her seem even smaller than usual in the large dining chair. "Is everything okay, Mr. Cole?" she asked softly, her voice uncertain and tinged with worry. "Of course," Harrison replied too quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes and felt wooden on his face. "Just busy with work." Ellie's face fell slightly, her eyes dimming, and she returned to picking at her food. Harrison felt a sharp pang of guilt, knowing she was probably wondering if she'd done something wrong to cause his distant behavior. At precisely 3 o'clock, Dr. Harris arrived, his Mercedes pulling up the circular driveway. His salt and pepper hair and kind face usually put everyone at ease, and today was no exception. Harrison introduced him to Ellie as an old friend who was doing routine health checks for foster children, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. "Hello, Ellie," Dr. Harris smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "This won't take long at all. Just a quick checkup to make sure you're healthy and strong." The examination took place in Harrison's home office, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Dr. Harris expertly collected a DNA sample while checking Ellie's throat, making it seem like a routine part of the examination. Ellie remained completely unaware, thanking the doctor politely when he finished, her innocent trust making Harrison's guilt deepen. After Ellie left, Harrison handed Dr. Harris an envelope containing his own DNA sample, collected earlier that morning. His hands trembled slightly as he passed it over, betraying his inner turmoil. "How long?" Harrison asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. 48 hours, Dr. Harris replied, carefully storing both samples in his medical bag. "I'll run these through the lab myself, Harrison. Complete confidentiality." He squeezed Harrison's shoulder reassuringly before leaving. As the afternoon faded into evening, Harrison's anxiety grew like a living thing in his chest. He paced in his study, unable to focus on work, his footsteps wearing an invisible path in the expensive carpet. Every time he heard footsteps in the hallway, he tensed, though he knew the results couldn't possibly arrive so soon. When night fell, Harrison sat in his leather armchair, Caroline's photograph in his hands, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. The study was dark, except for a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the room and reflecting off the glass covering Caroline's smiling face. "Could she really be mine?" he whispered to the photograph, studying Caroline's familiar features. Features he'd started seeing more and more in Ellie's face. The question hung in the air, unanswered, while outside his window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill, the kind that painted the trees outside in brilliant shades of red and gold. Harrison's hands trembled as he stared at the sealed envelope on his mahogany desk. Dr. Harris's familiar handwriting seemed to mock him, holding life-changing information within its crisp white folds, making his heart race with anticipation and fear. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady his nerves, Harrison tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the medical jargon until they landed on the conclusion: 99.9% probability of paternity. The paper shook in his grip, crackling softly in the silent room. "My daughter," he whispered, the words foreign yet somehow right on his tongue, like a key fitting perfectly into a long-forgotten lock. "She's my daughter." His legs gave way and he sank into his leather chair, the familiar leather creaking beneath his weight. Memories of Caroline rushed back like a tidal wave. Her bright smile on their first date, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, their shared dreams of a future together under starlit skies. Now he understood why Ellie's artistic talent seemed so familiar. Caroline had been an artist too, her paintings once filling their college apartment with color and life. The morning stretched on as Harrison paced his study, running his hands through his graying hair, wearing an invisible path in the expensive carpet. How had Caroline managed all alone? Why hadn't she told him about Ellie? His heart ached thinking of Caroline raising their daughter by herself, working to give Ellie everything she could, sacrificing her own dreams along the way. As evening settled in, painting long shadows across the study floor, Harrison called Jonathan Price, his trusted lawyer of 15 years. "Jonathan, I need your help securing my daughter's future," Harrison spoke into the phone, his voice thick with emotion and newfound purpose. "Yes, I said daughter. I just found out. I want to make sure she's taken care of, that she has everything she needs. This is my responsibility now." Unknown to Harrison, small footsteps had paused outside his study door, sock-covered feet silent against the hardwood floor. Ellie stood frozen, catching fragments of his conversation. Secure her future. Responsibility. The words echoed in her mind, taking on a different meaning altogether, each one striking like a tiny hammer against her fragile sense of belonging. Her lower lip trembled as she hurried back to her room, closing the door quietly behind her with practiced care. Sitting cross-legged on her window seat, the soft cushions offering little comfort, Ellie opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. Her pencil moved across the paper, creating dark clouds and twisted trees, each line etched with the weight of her fears. Tears threatened to fall as she added deeper shadows to her drawing, the graphite smudging beneath her trembling fingers. The mansion that had started to feel like home now seemed uncertain again, its warmth replaced by a familiar chill of doubt. Was she just another responsibility to Harrison? Another problem to solve? Like the business deals she sometimes heard him discussing on the phone? The night grew darker outside her window, matching the darkness of her sketch, the garden below disappearing into shadow. Ellie's pencil moved faster, harder, pouring her fears onto the paper with desperate energy. The resulting landscape was unlike her usual work, all sharp edges and heavy shadows, reflecting the turmoil in her young heart, a visual echo of her deepest fears of abandonment. Sunday morning cast long shadows across the breakfast table, the golden light filtering through the tall windows doing little to warm the atmosphere. The usual clinking of silverware seemed louder in the uncomfortable silence, each scrape and tap echoing in the spacious dining room. Ellie pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate with listless movements, avoiding Harrison's concerned gaze as she created little yellow mountains on her china plate. "Did you sleep well?" Harrison asked, trying to catch her eye, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. "Yes, thank you," Ellie mumbled, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mrs. Clara watched the exchange from the kitchen doorway, her weathered face creased with worry as she wiped her hands on her apron. She approached the table with a fresh glass of orange juice, the ice cubes clinking cheerfully against the crystal. "I was thinking we could bake cookies later, dear," Mrs. Clara suggested warmly, placing the glass near Ellie's plate. "Maybe those chocolate chip ones you liked? We could add extra chips this time." Ellie managed a tiny nod but remained withdrawn, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight, her fork pushing the same piece of egg back and forth. After breakfast, Harrison retreated to his study, running his hands through his hair in frustration as he paced the Persian rug. He wanted to reach out, to explain everything, but the words wouldn't come. What if he made things worse? Perhaps she just needed time to adjust to this new reality they shared. Upstairs in her room, Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed, her sketchbook open before her, the morning light streaming through her window. Her pencil moved frantically across the paper, creating harsh lines and deep shadows that seemed to leap off the page. The garden she drew wasn't the sunny, peaceful place from her earlier sketches. Now thorny vines twisted around dead flowers, and dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening an unseen storm. Page after page filled with her emotions, each stroke of the pencil releasing something she couldn't express in words. A shadowy figure standing alone in an empty hallway, shoulders slumped in silence. The mansion's windows like hollow eyes staring out into nothing, dark and unseeing. Each drawing darker than the last, matching the growing uncertainty in her heart. As evening approached, Harrison stood outside Ellie's door, gathering his courage, his hand hovering near the polished wood. He knocked softly, the sound gentle against the heavy oak. "Ellie," he called, his voice tender but uncertain. "Would you like to take a walk in the garden with me? The roses are blooming nicely. The pink ones you admired yesterday have opened up." There was a long pause before Ellie's quiet voice replied, muffled by the door between them. "No, thank you." Harrison's hand dropped from the doorknob, his fingers curling into a loose fist at his side. He lingered for a moment, wanting to say more but not knowing how to bridge the growing distance between them. Finally, he walked away, his footsteps heavy with disappointment in himself, echoing down the empty hallway. Inside her room, Ellie sat on her bed, staring at her latest drawing in the fading daylight. The mansion filled half the page, its grand architecture somehow looking cold and unwelcoming despite its elegant lines. The other half remained blank, as empty as she felt inside, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. Monday morning crept in with pale sunlight filtering through the dining room windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Ellie slid into her chair, her well-worn sketchbook clutched close as always, its corners softened from constant handling. Harrison looked up from his newspaper, the business section half folded, offering a gentle smile. "Good morning, Ellie," he said softly, his voice warm with genuine care. "Morning," she replied, reaching for a piece of toast from the silver rack at the center of the table. Harrison noticed her sketchbook on the table and cleared his throat, trying to bridge the quiet gap between them. Would you mind showing me what you're working on?" Ellie hesitated, her small hand hovering over the cover, fingers tracing its worn edges. After a long moment, she slowly opened it to her latest drawing. Harrison leaned forward, studying the dark sketch of his mansion. Storm clouds loomed overhead, heavy with unseen rain, and shadows seemed to seep from every window like ink bleeding through paper. "That's quite powerful," he said carefully, recognizing the emotions behind the stark lines. "You really capture emotion in your work." Later that day, as Harrison walked past one of the unused rooms on the second floor, he stopped, struck by inspiration. The space was bright and airy, with tall windows stretching nearly from floor to ceiling and pristine white walls that caught the afternoon light. An idea struck him, making his heart beat faster with possibility. "Ellie," he called, finding her curled up in the library with another sketch. "Could you come with me for a moment? I'd like to show you something." He led her to the empty room, watching her face for a reaction. "What would you think about turning these walls into your canvas? You could create a mural, anything you'd like. Make this space your own." Ellie's eyes widened slightly as she looked around the space, taking in every detail. Her fingers twitched at her sides, already imagining the possibilities, the colors, the shapes that could fill this blank canvas. "Really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could paint anything?" "Absolutely anything," Harrison confirmed, pleased by the spark of excitement in her eyes. Throughout the afternoon, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by preliminary sketches and color studies. Harrison occasionally poked his head in, genuinely curious, asking questions about her ideas and watching her work with growing admiration. "So this blue here," he said, pointing at a color swatch on one of her papers. "Is it more like the sky or more like blueberries?" His forehead wrinkled with concentration. Ellie couldn't help but giggle at his earnest confusion. "That's cerulean, Mr. Cole. It's like the ocean on a clear day." "Ah, yes, obviously," he said, scratching his head with an exaggerated look of confusion that made Ellie laugh again, the sound echoing off the empty walls. As they discussed different techniques, Harrison's genuine interest in understanding her art began to chip away at Ellie's carefully constructed walls. She found herself explaining color theory to him, growing increasingly animated as she shared her knowledge, amused by his earnest attempts to grasp the concepts. "So warm colors come forward and cool colors recede?" he asked, squinting at her sketches with endearing concentration. "Right," Ellie nodded, growing more animated as she explained. "Like how mountains look blue in the distance, getting darker and more purple the further away they are." That evening, Ellie sat on her bed, surrounded by sketches for the mural, her creativity flowing freely for the first time in months. Her pencil moved across the paper with renewed energy, creating flowing lines and organic shapes that seemed to dance across the page. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt a tiny spark of belonging, like maybe this huge house wasn't so scary after all. Maybe, just maybe, it could become something more than just another temporary stop along the way. Tuesday morning brought a gentle warmth to the breakfast table. Ellie stirred her oatmeal, sneaking glances at Harrison over her spoon. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a soft glow on their faces. The silence felt different today, comfortable rather than strained. "I was thinking about your mural," Harrison said, setting down his coffee and adjusting the newspaper beside his plate. "What inspired you to start drawing in the first place?" Ellie paused, considering the question, her spoon hovering above the bowl. "Mom used to buy me coloring books," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the swirling patterns in her oatmeal. "When I couldn't sleep, we'd color together until I got sleepy." Harrison nodded encouragingly, his heart tightening at the mention of Caroline. He could almost picture them, mother and daughter huddled together over a coloring book in the dim light of evening. Throughout the day, they spent time together in small moments. While Ellie worked on her mural sketches, Harrison brought her hot chocolate topped with tiny marshmallows and sat nearby in his leather armchair, asking gentle questions between answering work emails on his phone. "What was school like before?" He trailed off, not wanting to push too hard, watching her careful movements across the paper. Ellie's pencil slowed, her hand hesitating over the sketch. "I didn't have many friends," she admitted, shoulders hunching slightly. "The other kids thought I was weird because I was always drawing during recess." She picked up a blue pencil, shading carefully. "After Mom died, drawing helped me feel less alone. The teachers didn't notice me much, but my art teacher, Ms. Peters, she understood. She gave me extra paper and let me stay in during lunch sometimes." Harrison watched her work, his chest aching with regret. Every word revealed another piece of the life he should have been part of, another moment he'd missed. "Art makes everything feel better," Ellie continued, her voice barely above a whisper, focused intently on her drawing. "In the orphanage, when things got scary or loud, I could just draw and—" She gestured vaguely with her hands, searching for the right words. "Disappear into it, like nothing else existed." After Ellie went to bed that night, Harrison sat in his study, his laptop open to articles about art therapy and childhood trauma. The desk lamp cast a warm glow as he scrolled through page after page, describing how children used art to process difficult emotions, to communicate when words failed them. He read about color choices, line intensity, and the healing power of creative expression, making mental notes as he went. The more he read, the more pieces fell into place. Why Ellie's drawings shifted from dark to light. Why she clutched her sketchbook like a shield. Why certain spaces in his mansion appeared repeatedly in her work. Each revelation felt like a key unlocking another door to understanding his daughter. Later, he stood alone in the mural room, studying Ellie's preliminary sketches pinned to the wall. The moonlight filtering through the windows cast soft shadows across the paper. Each drawing told a story, her story, in ways words never could. His fingers traced the edge of a particularly detailed sketch, taking in every careful line and shadow, noting the delicate way she captured light and emotion. In that quiet moment surrounded by his daughter's artwork, Harrison made a silent promise to help her heal, to give her every opportunity to express herself, and to ensure she never felt invisible again. He would learn to speak her language of colors and shapes, to understand the stories hidden in every stroke of her pencil. Thursday afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mural room, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Ellie stood on a small stepladder, carefully sketching bold outlines in vibrant blues and purples. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, adding sweeping strokes of orange to the design. The colors seemed to dance together on the wall, bringing life to the previously blank space. Harrison walked in, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. His tie was slightly loosened after a long day at the office, and his expression was hesitant as he studied the wall, tilting his head. "The design is interesting, Ellie, but don't you think those colors might be too bold for this room?" Ellie's hand froze mid-stroke, her entire body tensing. The marker trembled slightly in her grip as she turned to look at him, her eyes wide with hurt and disappointment. "What do you mean, too bold?" Her voice quivered, small and uncertain. "I just thought something more subtle might—" Harrison started, but Ellie cut him off, her emotions finally bubbling over. "You don't understand anything about my art," she burst out, dropping the marker with a clatter. "You don't understand me at all. You're just like everyone else. You want me to be different, to be quieter, to be less." She gestured wildly at the wall, tears welling in her eyes, her chest heaving with emotion. "Ellie, that's not what I meant," Harrison stammered, reaching out helplessly. "I was just suggesting—" "I don't want your suggestions." Ellie climbed down the ladder, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "You're probably just going to send me back anyway, so what does it matter?" Before Harrison could respond, she ran from the room, her footsteps thundering up the stairs like a heartbeat of pain. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the mansion, making the crystal chandelier in the hallway tinkle softly. Harrison stood alone in the mural room, staring at the unfinished wall, the bold colors seeming to mock his failure. Mrs. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern, her hands clasped together. "Give her some time, Mr. Cole," she said softly, her voice gentle with understanding. "Sometimes space is what's needed." Harrison ran his hands through his hair in frustration, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean to upset her. I was trying to help, but everything I say seems to come out wrong." In her bedroom, Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by her sketches like a protective barrier. Tears dropped onto the pages as she stared at the drawings, smudging the careful lines she'd created. She hugged her knees to her chest, wondering if she'd been foolish to think she could ever truly belong here, in this grand house with its perfect rooms and its perfect owner who didn't understand her at all. Saturday morning light filtered through the library's tall windows, casting warm patches on the thick carpet. Ellie wandered between the towering shelves, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound books. She needed space to think, to be away from Harrison and his well-meaning but hurtful comments about her art. His words about making her paintings more marketable still stung, even though she knew he was trying to help. A worn blue book caught her eye. When she pulled it from the shelf, something fluttered to the floor. Bending down, Ellie picked up an old photograph, its edges softened with age. Her heart skipped a beat as she studied it. The photo showed a younger Harrison, his face relaxed and happy, standing next to a beautiful young woman. Her warm brown eyes and gentle smile seemed familiar somehow, like a half-remembered dream. They stood close together beneath a blooming cherry tree, both looking carefree and in love. Ellie turned the photo over, her hands trembling as she read the handwritten note. To Harrison, no matter what happens, I'll always love you. Caroline. Caroline. The name hit her like a thunderbolt, sending shivers down her spine. Mom? Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent library. She stared at the photo, drinking in every detail of the woman's face. Her mother's face, from the slight dimple in her cheek to the way her hair curled around her shoulders. Without thinking, Ellie clutched the photo to her chest and ran from the library. Her footsteps echoed through the mansion as she searched for Harrison, her heart pounding with each step, finally finding him in his study. What is this? Ellie demanded, thrusting the photo toward him, her hand shaking. Who is she to you? Harrison looked up from his desk, his face draining of color as he saw the photograph. Where did you? His voice trailed off as he took the photo with shaking hands, his fingers ghosting over the image. That's my mom, Ellie said, her voice rising thick with emotion. Why do you have a picture of my mom? Harrison sat heavily in his chair, his eyes fixed on Caroline's smiling face. The weight of years of secrets seemed to press down on his shoulders. Caroline was... He swallowed hard. She was the love of my life. What? Ellie's voice cracked like thin ice. We met in college, Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion. We fell in love, but my father, he didn't approve of our relationship. He threatened to cut me off, to ruin Caroline's career. She was studying to be a teacher then. So you just gave up? Ellie's eyes flashed with anger, her small fists clenched at her sides. You didn't fight for her? I was young and scared and... Harrison's voice faltered, shame written across his features. I made the biggest mistake of my life. Did you ever try to find her? Ellie demanded, tears welling in her eyes. Did you even care what happened to her? Harrison's silence was answer enough, heavy and damning in the quiet room. She was alone! Ellie shouted, tears streaming down her face, leaving wet trails on her cheeks. We were alone! And you were here in your big mansion the whole time. Before Harrison could respond, Ellie spun around and ran from the study, leaving him alone with the photograph and the weight of his regret, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway like an accusation. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across Harrison's study as he paced, the photograph of Caroline worn from hours of handling. Dark circles rimmed his eyes. He hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, not with the weight of yesterday's revelation hanging over him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ellie's hurt expression, her tears, her anger. He paused by the window, watching the garden below. Ellie sat beneath an old oak tree, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders. It's time, he whispered to himself, tucking Caroline's photo into his pocket. His feet felt heavy as he made his way down to the garden. Ellie didn't look up when he approached, her pencil moving furiously across the paper. Harrison hesitated before lowering himself onto the grass beside her. I owe you an apology, he began, his voice rough. I should have told you everything from the start. Ellie's pencil stilled, but she kept her eyes on her sketch. Your mother and I met in college, Harrison continued, fighting to keep his voice steady. She was the most beautiful, kind-hearted person I'd ever known. We fell in love quickly, deeply. He pulled out the photograph, holding it gently. But my father, he didn't approve, because of her race. He threatened to cut me off, to ruin her family's business. Harrison's voice cracked. I was a coward, Ellie. Instead of standing up to him, I let her go. I chose security over love, and it's been my biggest regret. Tears began rolling down Ellie's cheeks, dropping onto her sketchbook. I didn't know about you, Harrison admitted softly. If I had... Why didn't you look for us? Ellie's voice was barely a whisper, but her words cut through him like a knife. Why didn't you try harder? Harrison opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? How could he justify abandoning the woman he loved, unknowingly abandoning his own daughter? Mom was alone, Ellie continued, her voice growing stronger, angrier. She worked 2 jobs. She was always tired, but she never stopped loving me, never stopped fighting for me. And you? She finally looked at him, her eyes full of pain. You just gave up. Harrison felt the full weight of his failure crush him. He watched helplessly as Ellie gathered her sketchbook and stood. I need time to think, she said quietly, turning away from him. Harrison remained seated under the oak tree, watching his daughter walk away, the morning sun casting his shadow long and dark across the garden grass. The sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the mansion's circular driveway just before noon, its polished surface reflecting the autumn sunlight. Grant Cole stepped out, adjusting his designer suit with practiced precision and smoothing back his perfectly styled hair. His presence commanded attention, but there was something cold in his smile as he approached the front door, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone path. Mrs. Clara answered his knock, her usually warm expression tightening slightly as she recognized the visitor. Her hands instinctively clasped together in front of her apron. Mr. Grant, we weren't expecting you today. Can't a man surprise his brother? Grant's charm didn't quite reach his eyes as he brushed past her into the foyer. Where is Harrison? In his study, Harrison looked up from his paperwork as Grant strode in without knocking, the door swinging wide. Brother, I hear you've become quite the humanitarian lately. The words dripped with barely concealed sarcasm. Harrison's jaw tightened as he set down his pen. What brings you here, Grant? Oh, just curiosity about our family's newest addition. Grant settled into a leather chair, studying Harrison carefully, his manicured fingers drumming against the armrest. Though I must say, taking in some random orphan seems rather impulsive even for you. Ellie isn't random. Harrison's voice was firm, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his desk. And my decisions aren't up for discussion. Come now, Harrison, the Cole name carries weight. Have you considered how this might affect our reputation? Our legacy? Grant leaned forward, his expression sharp and calculating. Or is this just about assuaging your guilt over Caroline? Outside in the hallway, Ellie froze mid-step, her heart pounding as she heard her mother's name. Her small hand gripped the wall for support. You're playing house with this girl, Grant continued, his voice carrying through the door like poison. But what happens when you realize you're not cut out for fatherhood? When she becomes more trouble than she's worth? At lunch, the tension was palpable. Ellie pushed food around her plate while Grant dominated the conversation with pointed remarks about family tradition and bloodlines. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the formal dining room, making everything feel colder somehow. The Cole name has always stood for excellence, Grant said smoothly, eyeing Ellie over the rim of his water glass. We can't afford to dilute that with sentiment. Mrs. Clara noticed Ellie's shoulders hunching lower and quickly intervened, her motherly instincts kicking in. Ellie, dear, why don't you help me bring out the dessert? She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, guiding her toward the kitchen like a shield against Grant's cutting words. In the safety of the kitchen, Mrs. Clara squeezed Ellie's hand, her warm brown eyes full of understanding. Don't you worry about Mr. Grant, sweetheart. Some people just can't see past their own importance. She tucked a strand of hair behind Ellie's ear with maternal tenderness. But the damage was done. That evening, Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed, her beloved sketchbook in her lap, its familiar weight usually a comfort. For the first time since she could remember, no images came to mind. Her pencil remained still as Grant's words echoed in her head, making her feel like an intruder in this grand house she'd begun to think of as home. The moonlight streaming through her window cast long shadows across her blank page, much like the doubts now creeping across her heart. The mansion felt like it was closing in on Ellie. She spent Wednesday hiding in various corners of the house, her sketchbook clutched to her chest like armor. Every time she heard Grant's voice echoing through the halls, she'd slip away to another hiding spot, her heart pounding with each near miss. The grand rooms that had started to feel like home now seemed full of shadows. At dinner, The dining room crackled with tension. Mrs. Clara kept glancing worriedly between Harrison and Grant as she served the main course, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued. Ellie stared at her plate, pushing the food around with her fork, her appetite completely gone. The clink of silverware seemed unnaturally loud in the strained silence. "You know, Harrison," Grant said, swirling his wine glass with practiced elegance, "I admire how seriously you're taking these new responsibilities, though I wonder if you've really thought through the implications for our family." His words dripped with false concern. Harrison's knuckles turned white around his fork, his jaw clenched tight. "That's enough, Grant." "I'm only thinking of what's best for everyone," Grant continued smoothly, his smile never reaching his eyes. "The Cole name carries certain expectations." Harrison's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, the sudden sound making Ellie flinch. "Get out." "Excuse me?" Grant's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "I said get out. Now." Harrison's voice was quiet but firm, trembling with controlled anger. "You've overstayed your welcome." Grant's smile turned cold as he stood adjusting his expensive suit jacket. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you about the consequences of your charitable endeavors." The last words felt like poison in the air. Ellie fled the table before Grant had even finished speaking, tears burning in her eyes. She ran to her room, closing the door softly behind her, trying to make herself as small and quiet as possible. Late that night, when the mansion was quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, Ellie pulled her small suitcase from under the bed. She packed quickly and quietly, some clothes, her art supplies, and the few precious items she owned. Her hands trembled as she wrote a short note on her favorite drawing paper. "I don't belong here. Thank you for everything." The words blurred as tears fell on the page. The halls were dark and silent as she crept downstairs, each step careful and measured. She paused at the front door, looking back at the grand staircase one last time, her chest aching with what might have been. Then she slipped out into the night, the cool air wrapping around her like a blanket. Ms. Janine's small house was only a few miles away. Ellie had memorized the address from their letters after she left the orphanage, clinging to it like a lifeline. When she rang the doorbell, her former art teacher opened the door in her robe, surprise clear on her face in the porch light. "Ellie? Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Ellie burst into tears, and Ms. Janine quickly pulled her inside, wrapping her in a warm hug that smelled of paint and chamomile tea. "Oh, honey, come on in. Let's get you settled." Back at the mansion, dawn broke over the gardens, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Harrison walked into the dining room, expecting to find Ellie at breakfast. Instead, he found her note propped against a vase of flowers, and his world stopped turning. The paper trembled in his hands as he read the words. "Ellie?" His voice echoed through the empty halls as panic seized his chest, raw with fear and desperation. "Ellie!" The morning sun had barely risen when Harrison's phone rang, piercing the heavy silence of his sleepless night. His heart leaped when he saw Ms. Janine's name on the screen, his fingers fumbling as he answered. "She's here with me, Harrison," Ms. Janine said softly. "She's safe. She came to my door about an hour ago." Harrison let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank God. I've been searching everywhere. The park, the library, even the art store." "I know. But Harrison, she's hurting. Deeply." Ms. Janine's voice was gentle but firm, carrying years of experience dealing with wounded hearts. "I think you should come over. She needs to hear from you, even if she's not ready to talk back yet." Later that afternoon, Harrison stood on Ms. Janine's small porch, his hands trembling slightly as he knocked. The peeling blue paint beneath his knuckles reminded him of simpler times. Ms. Janine opened the door, her kind face showing concern, crow's feet deepening around her eyes. "She's upstairs," Ms. Janine whispered, ushering him inside. "First door on the right. But Harrison, she's refused to come out. Hasn't touched the sandwich I left for her." Harrison nodded and climbed the stairs, his footsteps heavy on the creaking wood. He stopped at Ellie's door, pressing his palm against the worn surface, trying to bridge the physical and emotional distance between them. "Ellie?" His voice cracked, betraying the storm of emotions within. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I've made so many mistakes. I haven't been the father you deserve." Silence answered him, thick and heavy. "I was scared," he continued, sliding down to sit with his back against the door, his expensive suit collecting dust from the hallway floor. "Scared of failing you, just like I failed your mother. But in trying to protect myself, I hurt you instead. I pushed you away when I should have pulled you closer." He heard a small shuffle inside the room, the sound of sock-covered feet moving across carpet. "You deserve so much better than what I've given you. Please, just give me a chance to make it right, to be the father you need." The door creaked open slowly, hinges protesting. Ellie stood there, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her favorite drawing pencil clutched in one hand. Harrison immediately knelt in front of her, not caring about his suit pants on the old carpet. "I promise you, Ellie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, fighting to keep steady. "You will never feel unwanted or unwelcome again. This is your home, if you still want it to be. You're not just a guest, you're family." Ms. Janine appeared in the hallway, her presence comforting like a warm blanket. "Remember, both of you, healing takes time. There's no rush. Small steps forward are still steps forward. Trust builds slowly, but it builds stronger that way." Ellie wiped her eyes with her sleeve, sniffling softly. "You promise?" she whispered to Harrison, her voice small but hopeful. "You really want me to stay?" "More than anything in the world," Harrison replied, meaning every word with all his heart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through Ms. Janine's windows and painting the walls in warm amber light, Harrison and Ellie prepared to leave. Harrison held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ellie took it. Her small fingers wrapped around his, a tentative bridge of trust rebuilding between them, fragile but real. The headlights cut through the darkness as Harrison's car wound its way back to the mansion. Every few minutes, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Ellie as she gazed out the window. Her sketchbook was pressed tightly against her chest like a shield, her fingers tracing the worn edges. The steady hum of the engine filled the silence between them, a reminder of all the words left unsaid. The mansion came into view, its windows glowing warmly in the night. Mrs. Clara stood waiting at the front door, wringing her hands, her face etched with concern. When Ellie stepped out of the car, clutching her sketchbook even tighter, Mrs. Clara's face softened with relief, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Welcome home, dear," she said softly, opening her arms. Ellie didn't move to hug her, but managed a small nod, her eyes fixed on the ground beneath her feet. Inside, Harrison cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the spacious foyer. "Would you like to talk?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady and reassuring. Ellie shook her head, her curls bouncing slightly. Without a word, she turned and headed up the stairs to her room, her footsteps growing fainter with each step. The sound of her door closing echoed through the quiet house, leaving a heaviness in its wake. Harrison spent hours in his study that night, surrounded by crumpled papers and dimming lamplight. Each attempt to write seemed inadequate, the words feeling hollow and insufficient. But finally, as midnight approached, the words began to flow. "Dear Ellie, there are so many things I wish I could say to you face to face, but I understand why that's difficult right now. I failed your mother, Caroline, when I didn't fight for our love. I let fear and others' expectations guide my choices instead of listening to my heart. And now I've been failing you too. Your mother was the most talented artist I've ever known until I met you. She could capture the soul of anything she drew, just like you do. When she laughed, her whole face lit up, and her eyes sparkled just like yours do when you're sketching. Sometimes when I watch you draw, I see so much of her in you that it takes my breath away. I want you to know that you belong here, Ellie. Not because of obligation or guilt, but because you're my daughter and I love you. I know I haven't shown that well enough, but I promise to do better every day if you'll give me the chance. Loved it, Dad." The next morning, Harrison knelt by Ellie's door and carefully slid the letter underneath, his hand lingering for a moment on the envelope. He heard soft footsteps approach from the other side, then silence as she picked it up. His heart seemed to pause, waiting. Hours passed and Harrison tried to focus on work in his study, but his thoughts kept drifting to Ellie. The stack of papers on his desk remained largely untouched. As evening settled in, painting the sky in deep purples and blues, he sat in the living room staring at the unlit fireplace, lost in memories and hope. Quiet footsteps padded down the stairs. Ellie appeared in the doorway, Harrison's letter folded carefully in her hand, its creases suggesting she had read it multiple times. Without a word, she crossed the room and sat beside him on the couch. Though she didn't speak or look at him directly, her presence felt like the first ray of sunshine after a storm, warming the space between them with possibility. The Saturday morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured garden as Harrison and Ellie stepped outside. Cherry blossoms dotted the winding pathways, and the air smelled sweet with spring flowers and fresh grass. Harrison's hands were tucked deep in his pockets, his shoulders tense with nervousness about the conversation ahead. Ellie walked beside him, her steps small and careful, occasionally stopping to examine a particularly vibrant bloom. They passed the rose garden where early buds were just beginning to show their colors, before Harrison finally spoke. "Your mother loved gardens," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to sketch the flowers at the university botanical gardens where we met. She could spend hours getting the details of a single petal just right." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes curious and hungry for information. "What else did she like?" Harrison's face softened with memories, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "She loved rainy days, said they were perfect for painting. She'd sit by the window in our favorite coffee shop, sketching people rushing by with umbrellas, capturing their hurried movements with just a few strokes." He paused near a weathered wooden bench. "Would you like to sit?" Ellie nodded and they settled on the bench together, the old wood creaking softly beneath them. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, sending cherry blossom petals dancing around their feet. "Your mother was the bravest person I've ever known," Harrison continued, his fingers absently tracing the grain of the wood. "When people looked down on our relationship because of our different backgrounds, she held her head high. She never let anyone make her feel small or less worthy. She taught me what real courage looked like." "Did she paint like me?" Ellie's voice was barely above a whisper, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Just like you, she could capture feelings in her art in a way that took my breath away. Every brushstroke told a story." Harrison's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. "I see so much of her in you, Ellie. Not just in your talent, but in your spirit. The way you observe the world, how deeply you feel things." Later that afternoon, Ellie made her way to the mural room, her favorite space in the massive house. She picked up her brushes with purpose, studying the blank wall before her, as if seeing beyond its white surface. Harrison sat quietly in the corner with some paperwork, offering his presence without interference, occasionally glancing up to watch her work. The soft scratching of brush against wall filled the room, mixing with the peaceful afternoon light streaming through the windows. Ellie's strokes were confident now, sure and steady, and slowly, colors began to bloom across the white surface like a garden coming to life. Harrison watched from his chair, his heart full as his daughter worked, recognizing Caroline's gift living on through their child. That evening, as Ellie headed to bed, she paused at her bedroom door. Instead of closing it completely as she had done every night before, her careful barrier against the world, she left it slightly ajar. It was a small gap, barely wider than a hand, but it spoke volumes about her willingness to let Harrison back into her life, a tiny bridge beginning to form between their two hearts. Sunday morning filled the mansion's dining room with golden light, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries drifted through the air as Ellie took her seat at the table, her small fingers smoothing down the crisp linen napkin in her lap. For the first time in days, she looked relaxed, her shoulders no longer tense with worry, and a gentle contentment softened her features. "Would you like some orange juice, dear?" Mrs. Clara asked, already reaching for the crystal pitcher that caught the morning light. Her motherly smile was as warm as the freshly baked pastries. "Yes, please," Ellie replied with a small smile, her eyes bright. "And maybe a chocolate croissant?" She glanced hopefully at the basket of still steaming pastries. Harrison looked up from his newspaper, his eyes crinkling with joy at hearing her voice. The morning paper lowered completely as he gave her his full attention. "The chocolate ones are my favorite too. They remind me of Sunday mornings when I was your age." Mrs. Clara bustled around them, her face glowing with approval as she watched Ellie take tiny bites of her pastry, careful not to drop any crumbs. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on simple topics like the weather and the garden's blooming flowers, with Mrs. Clara occasionally chiming in about the roses she'd been tending. Later that morning, Harrison helped Ellie sort through her art supplies in the mural room, the morning sun streaming through the large windows. They arranged brushes by size and organized paint tubes by color, working together in comfortable silence. The simple task felt like building something important between them. "I think we should get you some new supplies," Harrison suggested, examining a worn-out brush with fraying bristles. "Whatever you need for the mural, we could make a special trip to the art store together." Before Ellie could respond, raised voices echoed from downstairs, breaking their peaceful moment. Grant had arrived unannounced again, his tone demanding and sharp enough to carry through the house. Harrison's jaw tightened, and a shadow crossed his face. "Excuse me for a moment," he said gently to Ellie, his voice carefully controlled. "Why don't you start sketching? I'll be right back." He gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before leaving. Harrison found Grant in the foyer, already launching into another lecture about family reputation, his hands gesturing dramatically. This time, Harrison didn't let him finish, drawing himself up to his full height. "That's enough, Grant." Harrison's voice was firm and clear, echoing off the marble floors. "Your comments about Ellie have been hurtful and unwelcome. I want you to leave." His words carried the weight of years of pent-up confrontations. "Harrison, be reasonable." Grant's face showed the familiar mix of condescension and manipulation. "Number Ellie is my daughter, and she's my priority now. I won't let anyone make her feel unwanted in her own home, not even you." Harrison stood his ground, shoulders squared and gaze unwavering. Grant's face reddened, but something in Harrison's stance told him this wasn't a battle he could win. Without another word, he turned and left, the heavy front door closing firmly behind him. When Harrison returned to the mural room, he found Ellie sketching peacefully by the window, her pencil moving with sure strokes across the paper. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes held a new light, one of trust and belonging that made his heart swell. That evening, they sat together in the mural room, comfortable in each other's presence. Ellie worked on her sketches while Harrison read nearby, the sound of pencil on paper mixing with the gentle rustle of turning pages. The room felt warm, filled with an understanding that needed no words, as the setting sun painted the walls in soft oranges and pinks. It was more than just a room now. It was becoming their special place, where father and daughter could simply be together. Monday morning streamed through the mansion's windows, bringing with it a fresh start. Ellie stood in the mural room, her paintbrush poised against the wall. The blank canvas before her seemed less daunting now, filled with possibility rather than pressure. Throughout the morning, Harrison would quietly peek in, watching as Ellie mixed colors and sketched outlines. "That's looking wonderful," he'd say softly, careful not to interrupt her concentration. As the days passed, the mural took shape. Bold strokes of green formed the garden's rolling lawns, while delicate brushwork captured the mansion's architectural details. Ellie worked with intense focus, only stopping when Mrs. Clara insisted she take breaks for meals. "The light in the garden is perfect," Harrison commented on Wednesday, noticing how Ellie had captured the way sunbeams filtered through the trees. She smiled, adding another layer of color to the sky. By Friday afternoon, Ellie stepped back from the completed mural, her hands speckled with paint. The scene before them took Harrison's breath away. There, spanning the wall, was their story. A young girl standing proud before the mansion, surrounded by vibrant flowers and warm sunshine. He recognized the exact bench where they'd shared their first real conversation, the rose bushes where they'd walked together, and countless other small details that made their home special. The artistic skill was impressive, but what moved Harrison most was the emotion woven into every brushstroke. He could see Ellie's journey from uncertainty to belonging, her fear transforming into hope. Kneeling beside her, Harrison placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ellie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so incredibly proud of you. Not just because of this beautiful mural, but because of who you are, your strength, your courage, everything about you." Ellie's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with tears. They sat together on the floor, taking in the mural as evening light painted the room in soft golden hues. "Dad?" Ellie said quietly, the words still new on her tongue. "I think I'm ready to call this place home." On Sunday morning, Harrison sat in his study, surrounded by dusty cardboard boxes. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. He'd been meaning to go through these old memories for weeks now, hoping to find something, anything that could help Ellie understand her mother better. Each box felt like opening a time capsule, filled with fragments of a past he'd tried so hard to forget. His hands trembled as he opened another box, filled with letters and photographs from his college years. The familiar scent of aged paper wafted up, stirring memories he thought he'd buried long ago. At the bottom, partially hidden beneath a stack of photos, lay an envelope he'd never seen before. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized Caroline's elegant handwriting, the swooping curves of her letters as distinctive as her smile had been. The envelope was still sealed, dated just weeks after their separation. Harrison's fingers shook as he carefully opened it, his throat tight with emotion. The paper crackled softly under his touch, like autumn leaves. "My dearest Harrison," the letter began. "I don't know if you'll ever read these words, but I need to write them anyway. My heart breaks knowing we couldn't overcome the walls between us, but my love for you remains unchanged." The ink had faded slightly over the years, but Caroline's words remained clear and powerful. Harrison had to pause, wiping tears from his eyes. The weight of lost time pressed heavily on his shoulders as he continued reading. Caroline's words painted a picture of hope and dreams for their daughter. "Our beautiful Ellie deserves a world where love knows no boundaries," she wrote. "I dream of a day when you might know her, when the prejudices that tore us apart no longer have power over our lives." Her words carried both sadness and an unshakable optimism that made his chest ache. That afternoon, Harrison found Ellie in the mural room, adding final touches to her artwork. Her brush moved with careful precision across the wall, each stroke deliberate and focused. "I found something I'd like to share with you," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. They settled into the leather chairs in his study. The familiar creaking of the old leather seemed to echo the weight of the moment. Ellie held the letter carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. Her voice wavered as she began to read aloud but grew stronger with each word, like a flower turning toward the sun. "I see so much of you in our daughter, Harrison," she read. "She has your quiet strength, your gentle heart. Even now, as I watch her sleep, I see glimpses of the man I fell in love with." Her fingers traced the words as she read them, as if trying to absorb her mother's touch through the paper. Tears rolled down Ellie's cheeks as she continued reading. Harrison moved closer, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, feeling her small frame tremble beneath his touch. The letter spoke of Caroline's hopes for Ellie's future, her dreams that their daughter would grow up knowing she was deeply loved, that she would find her place in the world. Each word seemed to bridge the gap between past and present. When Ellie finished reading, she carefully folded the letter and held it close to her heart. The study fell silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock, marking time in steady, comforting beats. "Mom really loved you," Ellie whispered, looking up at Harrison with new understanding in her eyes. The afternoon light caught the tears on her cheeks, making them shimmer. Harrison nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Years of regret and love merged into a single, overwhelming emotion. Ellie opened her sketchbook, which was never far from her side, and gently placed the letter between its pages like pressing a precious flower. She turned to Harrison, her eyes bright with tears, but also with something else. Hope, perhaps, or acceptance. In that moment, she looked so much like Caroline that it made his heart ache. "I think she would have been proud of you," Ellie said softly, her words filling the space between them with warmth and possibility. The morning sun cast long shadows across the estate's manicured lawns as Harrison and Ellie walked side by side through the gardens. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Harrison's steps were measured, deliberate, as if each one brought him closer to a truth he needed to share. "There's something I want to tell you about my father," Harrison began, his voice soft but steady. "He was a man who believed appearances and social status were everything. When I fell in love with your mother, Harrison paused, collecting his thoughts. He couldn't see past his own prejudices. Ellie listened intently as they continued walking, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "For years I let his disapproval control my life," Harrison admitted, stopping near a rosebush. "I was too afraid to stand up to him, too worried about disappointing him. But meeting you?" He turned to face Ellie. "You've shown me it's never too late to make things right." Ellie kicked at a small pebble on the path. "Sometimes at the orphanage I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere," she confessed. "The other kids, they had their groups and their games, but I always felt different." "What helped you get through it?" Harrison asked gently. "Drawing," Ellie replied, clutching her sketchbook closer. "When I drew, I could create my own world where everything made sense." They reached a magnificent oak tree at the edge of the estate. Its branches spread wide, creating a natural canopy above them. Harrison stopped, looking thoughtfully at the space beneath the tree. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we could create something special here, a garden dedicated to your mother." Ellie's eyes lit up. She opened her sketchbook immediately, her pencil flying across the paper. "We could plant her favorite flowers," she suggested, sketching rapidly. "And maybe add a small bench?" Harrison watched as she worked, adding details to her drawing, clusters of wildflowers, winding paths, and a wooden bench nestled among the blooms. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and he found himself suggesting different flowers and arrangements. When she finished, Ellie held up her sketch proudly. The drawing captured not just the physical layout, but also the feeling of peace and remembrance they both envisioned. Harrison looked at the sketch, his eyes warm with pride. "It's perfect," he said softly. Friday afternoon found Harrison standing in the doorway of Ellie's art studio, watching as she added delicate brushstrokes to her latest painting. He cleared his throat softly to get her attention. "Ellie, I have something to show you," he said, holding up a colorful flyer. "There's an art competition tomorrow at the local gallery. I thought maybe you'd like to enter." Ellie's brush paused mid-stroke. "A competition?" Her voice was quiet, uncertain. "Yes, it's for children your age," Harrison explained, moving closer to show her the details. "The theme is finding home." Ellie bit her lip, her eyes drifting to a painting she'd completed weeks ago, shortly after arriving at the mansion. It showed a small girl standing before an imposing house, her figure dwarfed by the grand architecture. The sky above held both storm clouds and patches of sunlight, reflecting the mix of hope and uncertainty she'd felt. Would this one be good enough?" she asked hesitantly, pointing to the painting. Harrison studied the piece, his expression softening. "It's perfect, Ellie. Absolutely perfect." The next morning buzzed with nervous energy. Mrs. Clara helped Ellie pick out a special outfit, while James carefully wrapped the painting for transport. Harrison paced the foyer, checking his watch repeatedly. At the gallery, Ellie's eyes widened at the crowd of people milling about. Children her age stood proudly beside their artwork while parents and judges wandered through the displays. She clutched her painting tighter. Harrison knelt beside her, gently squeezing her shoulder. "You've got this," he whispered encouragingly. As they hung her painting, Ellie's hands trembled slightly, but she stood tall. Throughout the morning, she watched as judges stopped to study her work, their expressions thoughtful as they made notes. When the time came for announcements, Ellie held her breath. The gallery director stepped forward, microphone in hand. "First prize goes to Ellie Harper." The room erupted in applause. Ellie stood frozen until Mrs. Clara gave her a gentle nudge forward. As she accepted her award, her eyes found Harrison in the crowd. His face shone with pride, matching her own beaming smile. Back at the mansion that evening, Ellie carefully placed her award on the shelf in her studio. She turned to Harrison, her eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly. Harrison's response was immediate and heartfelt. Always. The peaceful Sunday afternoon shattered when the doorbell rang through the mansion. Harrison's jaw tightened as he opened the door to find Grant standing there, wearing his most charming smile. "Brother," Grant said smoothly, "I've come to make things right between us." From the corner of his eye, Harrison noticed Ellie freeze in the hallway before quickly retreating to the kitchen where Mrs. Clara was preparing tea. The housekeeper immediately wrapped a protective arm around the girl's shoulders. "What do you want, Grant?" Harrison's voice was cold. "Can't a man visit his own brother?" Grant stepped inside uninvited. "We need to talk about the family's future." In Harrison's study, Grant didn't waste time dropping his facade. "Have you lost your mind?" he hissed. "Making that girl your heir? Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's reputation?" "Ellie is my daughter," Harrison's voice was steel, "and she deserves everything I can give her." "Your daughter? Because of one DNA test?" Grant scoffed. "She's the product of a relationship Father warned you about. Think about the scandal." "I don't care about scandals or what Father would have thought," Harrison cut him off. "Ellie is my child, my heir, and nothing you say will change that." Outside in the hallway, Ellie pressed closer to Mrs. Clara as fragments of the argument reached them. "Damage to our name. Shouldn't be heir. Father would never—" "Don't you listen to him, dear," Mrs. Clara whispered, hugging Ellie tighter. "Your father loves you more than anything." Grant's voice grew louder. "You're making a mistake, Harrison. This girl will destroy everything our family built." "The only mistake I made was not finding her sooner," Harrison shouted back. "Now get out." Grant stormed from the study, pausing only to glare at Ellie and Mrs. Clara. "Someone has to clean up this mess," he spat before slamming the front door. That evening, Ellie found Harrison in the living room. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for defending me." Harrison pulled her into a hug. "You're my daughter, Ellie. Nothing and no one can change that." On Monday evening, the living room was bathed in warm lamplight as Harrison sat on the plush sofa, surrounded by old photo albums. Ellie quietly entered and settled beside him, her eyes drawn to a photograph of Caroline laughing at what appeared to be a college festival. "Dad?" Ellie's voice was soft. "Could you tell me more about Mom? About what happened between you two?" Harrison's fingers trembled as he touched the photograph. "Your mother was the bravest person I knew," he began. "She never backed down from what she believed in." Taking a deep breath, Harrison described the last time he saw Caroline. It was a crisp autumn day, and they had met at their favorite coffee shop near campus. His father's ultimatum still rang in his ears. Leave Caroline or lose everything, the family connections, the inheritance, his future. "I was a coward," Harrison admitted, his voice cracking. "I told her we couldn't be together anymore. She knew immediately it was because of my father." He closed his eyes, remembering Caroline's face. "She didn't cry or beg, she just looked at me with such disappointment." Ellie wiped tears from her cheeks. "But why didn't you look for her later, when you were stronger?" "By the time I finally stood up to my father, years had passed. Caroline had disappeared completely. No forwarding address, no mutual friends who knew where she'd gone." Harrison's shoulders slumped. "I hired private investigators, but she'd started fresh somewhere else. I never knew about you until now." Tears streamed down Ellie's face as she absorbed the weight of their shared history. Her mother's strength in raising her alone, Harrison's regret at choosing family pressure over love. Looking at her father's grief-stricken face, Ellie reached out and placed her hand over his. "She forgave you," she said softly. "I know she did, and I'm learning to forgive you too." Tuesday morning dawned bright and clear. Ellie sat at the breakfast table, pushing her scrambled eggs around her plate as she gathered courage. Finally, she looked up at Harrison. "Dad?" she began hesitantly. "I've been thinking. What if we made a special room for Mom, like a gallery to remember her?" Harrison's fork paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes softened as he processed Ellie's suggestion. That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart." They decided to use the sunny room on the second floor that overlooked the garden. Ellie immediately pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing layouts, her excitement growing with each stroke of her pencil. "We could put Mom's photos here," she explained, pointing to one wall. "And maybe some of my paintings inspired by her stories over there?" Mrs. Clara joined their effort, helping them search through dusty boxes in storage. Each item they discovered felt like a precious gift. Caroline's cream-colored cashmere scarf still holding a hint of her perfume, her leather-bound diary filled with elegant handwriting and countless photographs capturing her radiant smile. "Oh my," Mrs. Clara exclaimed softly, pulling out a small box. Inside was a collection of dried flowers, preserved corsages from Harrison and Caroline's college dates. Harrison picked up one pressed rose, his voice thick with emotion. She kept them all. As they worked on the gallery, stories flowed naturally between father and daughter. Harrison shared memories of Caroline's infectious laugh and her passion for justice, while Ellie told him about the little things she remembered, the way her mother hummed while cooking, how she always braided Ellie's hair before bed. The centerpiece of the gallery became Ellie's painting, a large canvas showing Caroline in a flowing summer dress, her hand holding that of a young Ellie. The sunlight in the painting seemed to dance around them, capturing the joy and love they shared. When everything was ready, Harrison and Ellie stood together in the completed space. Photographs lined the walls, telling the story of Caroline's life. Her scarf was carefully displayed in a glass case alongside her diary and other treasured items. Ellie's artwork, inspired by memories and stories, added splashes of color throughout the room. Standing before her painting of Caroline, Ellie whispered, "I hope she would have loved this." Harrison wrapped an arm around her shoulders and replied softly, "She would have loved you most of all." Friday morning brought a surprise that made Ellie's face light up. Harrison had arranged a special visit to Ms. Janine's cozy home, tucked away on a quiet street lined with maple trees. As they pulled up to the modest house, Ellie could barely contain her excitement. Ms. Janine welcomed them with warm hugs and the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting from her kitchen. Her eyes sparkled as she led them into her living room, where student artwork covered nearly every wall. "I heard about your win at the art competition," Ms. Janine beamed, squeezing Ellie's hand. "I always knew you had something special, dear." Ellie blushed, showing Ms. Janine photos of her winning piece on her phone. As they chatted about techniques and colors, Harrison cleared his throat softly. "Actually, Ms. Janine, we came here today because I wanted to discuss something important," Harrison began, his voice gentle but determined. "I've been thinking about ways to honor Caroline's memory and help other children who share Ellie's passion for art." He explained his vision for the Caroline Harper Memorial Scholarship Program, designed to support young artists from underprivileged backgrounds. The program would provide art supplies, classes, and mentorship opportunities to children who might otherwise never get the chance to develop their talents. Ellie's eyes grew wide as she listened to Harrison detail his plans. Her heart swelled with pride and love, seeing how much thought he'd put into honoring her mother's memory. "And Ms. Janine," Harrison continued, "I was hoping you might help oversee the program. Your experience nurturing young talent would be invaluable." Ms. Janine's eyes welled with tears. "Oh, Harrison," she said, clasping her hands together. "I would be honored. Caroline always believed in giving children a chance to express themselves through art. This is exactly what she would have wanted." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities for the program, with Ms. Janine offering insights from her years of teaching. Ellie watched them plan, her heart full of gratitude for these two adults who believed so strongly in the power of art to change lives. As they prepared to leave, Ellie looked up at Harrison and said softly, "Thank you for remembering her, and for believing in me." Harrison smiled down at her, replying, "You've made it easy." The mansion's peaceful Sunday afternoon was shattered by the crunch of tires on gravel. Harrison's shoulders tensed as he recognized his brother Grant's sleek black car pulling up to the front door. "What a lovely surprise," Grant announced, stepping into the foyer with practiced charm. His designer suit and polished smile couldn't mask the calculating look in his eyes. "I've come to make things right, brother." Harrison remained silent, studying his younger brother's face. Mrs. Clara, sensing the tension, quietly ushered Ellie toward the kitchen. The young girl gladly followed, keeping her distance from Grant. "Let's talk in the study," Harrison said firmly, leading the way. Once behind closed doors, Grant's pleasant facade cracked. "Really, Harrison? You're going to let this child inherit the Cole legacy? Have you thought about what this will do to our family's reputation?" "Ellie is my daughter," Harrison replied, his voice steady but sharp. "She has every right to be here." "A secret love child with no proper upbringing?" Grant scoffed. "Father would be appalled." "Father's prejudices destroyed enough lives," Harrison shot back. "I won't let that happen again." Outside in the hallway, Ellie pressed closer to Mrs. Clara as fragments of the heated conversation drifted through the door. Her stomach twisted at Grant's words about proper upbringing and family reputation. "Don't you listen to him, dear," Mrs. Clara whispered, squeezing Ellie's shoulder. "Your father loves you more than anything." Grant's voice grew louder. "You're making a mistake, Harrison. This girl will never truly fit into our world." "She already has," Harrison declared. "This is her home and I am her father. That's all that matters." Frustrated, Grant stormed out of the study. He paused in the foyer, straightening his jacket. "I hope you're prepared to clean up this mess," he said coldly. "Some responsibilities can't be ignored." The front door slammed behind him. That evening, Ellie found Harrison in the living room. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing up for me." Harrison pulled her close. "You're my daughter, Ellie. Nothing and no one can change that." The warm glow of table lamps filled the living room as Ellie settled onto the couch beside Harrison. An old leather photo album lay open on his lap, its pages yellowed with time. She peered at a photo of a young woman with her same curly hair and bright smile. "Could you tell me more about her?" Ellie asked softly. "About Mom?" Harrison's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. "Your mother was the most vibrant person I'd ever met. She lit up every room she walked into." As they flipped through more photos, Harrison's voice grew heavy. He paused at an image of him and Caroline at a college festival, both laughing at something long forgotten. "The last time I saw her?" Harrison's words caught in his throat. "It was a rainy Tuesday. My father had called me into his study that morning. He told me I had to choose, Caroline or my inheritance. The family name, the connections, everything." Ellie watched tears form in Harrison's eyes. "What happened?" "I was a coward," he whispered. "I let fear control me. When I told Caroline it was over, she just looked at me with such disappointment. Not anger, just sadness. She deserved so much better." "Did you try to find her later?" Ellie asked, wiping her own tears away. Harrison nodded, his shoulders slumping. "By the time I finally gathered the courage to stand up to my father, she was gone. No forwarding address, no mutual friends who knew where she went. I searched for months, but she'd disappeared completely." Ellie's heart ached as she watched her father struggle with the weight of his past decisions. She could see now how deeply he had loved her mother, and how heavily the guilt had pressed on him all these years. Gently, she placed her hand over his. "She forgave you, I know she did. And I'm learning to forgive you too." The morning sunlight streamed through the mansion's windows as Ellie knocked on Harrison's study door. Her sketchbook was clutched tightly to her chest, filled with fresh ideas that had kept her up most of the night. "Dad?" she called softly. "I had an idea." Harrison looked up from his desk, smiling at her use of the word dad. "What's on your mind?" "I think we should make a special room for Mom," Ellie said, her words tumbling out quickly. "Like a gallery to remember her by." Harrison's eyes softened. "That's..." That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. They chose a bright corner room on the second floor, with large windows that reminded Harrison of Caroline's love for natural light. Ellie immediately began sketching layouts, planning where each memory would go. Mrs. Clara helped them dig through storage boxes in the attic, uncovering treasures they hadn't known existed. A silk scarf in deep purple, Caroline's favorite color, still carried a faint trace of her perfume. Harrison's hands trembled as he lifted out a small leather-bound diary. She wrote in this every day, he explained to Ellie. It was her way of processing the world. As they sorted through photographs and letters, stories flowed naturally between them. Harrison shared tales of Caroline's infectious laugh and her passion for helping others. Ellie worked quietly on a centerpiece for the gallery, a large painting of Caroline holding hands with a young Ellie, both of them smiling brightly in a sun-drenched garden. When the room was finally ready, Harrison and Ellie stood together before the painting. Tears glistened in Ellie's eyes as she whispered, "I hope she would have loved this." Harrison squeezed her shoulder gently. "She would have loved you most of all." The morning sun cast long shadows across Ms. Janine's front porch as Harrison's car pulled into her driveway. Ellie practically bounced in her seat with excitement at seeing her former mentor again. Ms. Janine opened her door with a warm smile, her silver hair neatly tied back. "Ellie and Mr. Cole, what a wonderful surprise." Inside Ms. Janine's cozy living room, surrounded by artwork from her many students over the years, they settled onto well-worn couches. The walls were covered in children's paintings, including several of Ellie's early pieces. "I heard about your win at the art competition," Ms. Janine beamed. "First place. I always knew you had something special, dear." Ellie blushed, ducking her head. "I couldn't have done it without your encouragement." Harrison cleared his throat softly. "Actually, Ms. Janine, that's partly why we're here today. I've been thinking about Caroline, about her passion for art and her desire to help others." He leaned forward, his eyes bright with purpose. "I want to create a scholarship program in her name, specifically for young artists who might not otherwise have the opportunity to pursue their dreams." Ms. Janine's eyes widened as Harrison explained his vision. Art supplies, classes, mentorship opportunities, everything he wished Caroline could have had access to when she was young. "And," Harrison added, "I was hoping you might help oversee the program. Your experience with young artists, your dedication to nurturing talent, you'd be perfect for this role." Ellie watched as Ms. Janine's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my dear," she said, reaching for Harrison's hand. "I would be honored, truly honored." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, with Ellie contributing ideas about what young artists might need most. Her own experiences in the orphanage had taught her the value of having someone believe in your talent. As they prepared to leave, Ellie turned to Harrison, her heart full of emotion. "Thank you for remembering her, and for believing in me." Harrison's smile was gentle as he replied, "You've made it easy." Monday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the mansion's windows. Ellie stood before her unfinished mural, paintbrush in hand, determination written across her face. The past few weeks had been a journey of healing, and every brushstroke told part of that story. Harrison lingered in the doorway, watching his daughter work. Her movements were confident now, so different from the hesitant girl who had first arrived at the mansion. The mural was taking its final shape, a masterpiece that blended reality with imagination in vibrant colors and flowing lines. As evening approached, Ellie stepped back from her work. Paint splattered on her overalls. She took a deep breath and nodded to herself. "It's ready," she said softly. Mrs. Clara and James joined Harrison as Ellie unveiled the completed mural. The artwork stretched across the wall, telling her story in breathtaking detail. At its heart stood three figures, Ellie in the center, flanked by Caroline and Harrison. The mansion's gardens sprawled around them, filled with blooming flowers and whimsical elements that spoke of dreams and hope. Mrs. Clara pressed her hand to her heart, tears welling in her eyes. James, usually stoic, smiled warmly. Harrison stepped closer, taking in every detail. The way Ellie had captured Caroline's gentle smile, the subtle changes in the mansion's appearance from forbidding to welcoming, the small symbols of her journey scattered throughout the piece. "Ellie," Harrison's voice cracked with emotion. "This is extraordinary. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Not just because of your incredible talent, but because of who you are. Your strength, your resilience, everything you've overcome to be here." Ellie's eyes glistened as she accepted Harrison's embrace. The mural behind them seemed to glow in the evening light, a testament to their journey together. Later that night, Ellie sat in her art studio gazing at her creation. The soft sound of footsteps announced Harrison's arrival. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said softly, "You've turned this house into a home." The mansion buzzed with excitement on Thursday evening as guests began arriving for the special gathering. Soft classical music played in the background while servers circulated with appetizers. Ellie, wearing a pretty blue dress picked out by Mrs. Clara, stood nervously beside Harrison near the entrance to the mural room. "Remember," Harrison whispered, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze, "tonight is about celebrating you and your incredible talent." As guests filtered in, their gasps of amazement echoed through the room. The mural commanded attention, its colors more vibrant in the carefully arranged lighting. Mrs. Warren from the orphanage stood misty-eyed before it, while Ms. Janine beamed with pride at her former student. "The detail is extraordinary," remarked one of Harrison's colleagues, studying the intricate patterns woven throughout the piece. Ellie began to relax as more people approached her with genuine interest in her work. She found herself explaining her artistic choices to a small group, including Sarah and Michael, children of Harrison's business partners. They listened intently, asking questions about her techniques and sharing their own interests in art. The highlight of the evening came when Harrison gently clinked his glass for attention. The room fell silent as he stood before the mural, Ellie at his side. "Many of you know me as a businessman," he began, his voice warm with emotion. "But tonight, I stand before you as a proud father. When Ellie came into my life, she brought with her not just extraordinary artistic talent, but a spirit that has transformed this house into a home." He looked down at Ellie, his eyes shining. "This mural represents more than just artistic skill. It tells the story of family, of healing, and of finding where you belong." Ellie felt tears welling up as Harrison continued, describing their journey together and how much she had inspired him to be a better person. The guests listened intently, many nodding in understanding and appreciation. As the evening progressed, Ellie found herself surrounded by her new friends. Sarah invited her to join their weekend art club, while Michael shared his favorite sketching spots in the city. For the first time, Ellie felt truly part of this world, not as an outsider, but as Harrison Cole's daughter. When the last guests departed, Harrison and Ellie stood together before the mural. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the evening air. Harrison looked at her and said softly, "This is only the beginning. I can't wait to see what you create next." The mansion settled into a peaceful quiet on Friday evening, the excitement from the previous night's celebration still hanging in the air like a gentle mist. Harrison walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing softly until he reached Ellie's art studio. There he found her bent over her sketchbook, her curly hair falling forward as she worked intently on a new piece. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Ellie looked up with a smile and nodded. Harrison moved closer to see what she was working on. It was a portrait of the two of them, based on a photograph Mrs. Clara had captured during the party. In the sketch, they stood side by side in front of the mural, both smiling genuinely. "That's beautiful," Harrison said, pulling up a chair beside her. He watched as her pencil moved confidently across the paper, adding subtle details to their faces. "Everything's changed so much," he reflected, his voice gentle. "Before you came, this house was just empty. But you've brought light back into it, Ellie. You've given me a second chance to be the father I always wanted to be." Ellie paused her sketching and looked up at him. "You've given me a second chance too," she said softly. Harrison smiled, then cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about the scholarship program we created in your mother's name," he said. "I want to expand it, help more young artists like you. Would you like to help me choose the first group of recipients?" Ellie's eyes lit up. Really? I'd love to. She put down her pencil and turned to face him fully. Do you think we could help kids from the orphanage too? That's exactly what I was thinking, Harrison replied, warmth filling his chest at her enthusiasm. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, Ellie returning to her sketch while Harrison picked up a spare pencil and paper, attempting to draw alongside her. His artistic skills were nowhere near hers, but that didn't matter. What mattered was this moment, father and daughter side by side, their smiles reflecting the joy they'd found in each other. As Ellie added the final touches to her portrait, she carefully wrote a title at the bottom, A Father's Redemption. If you enjoyed the story of Harrison, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.